Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing it. You've already been thanked so many times that it's getting boring, but I can't help but expressing my thankfulness. Also, a lot of what I'm going to say, not everything I will, but quite a bit overlaps with Alex's talk earlier. Also, unfortunately, I agree a lot with what you said, so I will probably sound repetitive in some way. There's a handout.
It means we're right.
Yes. Yeah.
You agree, yes.
There's a handout. Okay. So, it is of course well known that Kant's conception of the autonomy of the will plays a very important role in his philosophy. He also has a conception of epistemic autonomy, though he doesn't use that term. And it's, of course, based on the idea of thinking for oneself, the core idea of enlightenment, according to Kant. I try to do 4 things, or go through 4 sections at different speeds. In the first section, I will talk a bit about the nature and scope of thinking for oneself, which leads me to the distinction between 2 kinds of epistemic autonomy. Then I will talk about a potential conflict between 2 epistemic norms relevant to autonomy. I will then go into the social aspect, there's some repetition there, of epistemic autonomy. And finally, this will be the shortest thing, I think, go into justifiable and unjustifiable restrictions of epistemic autonomy. So let me start with the first bit, thinking for oneself, its nature, scope, and 2 types of epistemic autonomy. So, thinking for oneself, what is that? Well, one salient expression here is the idea, now I have it in English and German, sich seines Verstandes ohne Leitung eines anderen zu bedienen, to make use of one's understanding, own understanding without direction of another. So the idea is that whenever one considers the answer to some question, what could it be, we are supposed to use our own reasoning abilities, where I use the word reason or Verstand or understanding in a very broad sense, not in the more technical sense that we also find in the first critique. Now one might wonder what Kant meant by that. Did he mean that the ability to do that is sufficient, or do we also need manifestations of that ability? And I think it would be very uncharitable to think that the mere ability to use one's understanding, but never using it, would be sufficient for being enlightened. So you have to use your own reasoning ability. Not all the time, we can't do that. That would be an unreasonable expectation. And not on all questions, not on all kinds of trivial questions. If you ask me, could you think for your own about the number of these rectangular things on the wall, I would say, well, if you have the answer, please give it to me, I can't be bothered. That's not important enough. So this shows us that being enlightened is a graded thing. It allows for different kinds of degrees, both with respect to the question what you're thinking about, and also with respect to the question how much you think about it on your own. Now, what does ohne Leitung eines anderen, without direction from another, mean? I think what's meant here must be something partial. It's hard for me, it's very hard for me to say the least, to imagine what it would mean for me to be completely, in my thinking, to be completely under the direction of another. It wouldn't be my thinking anymore, I suspect. So it has to be partial. So again, matters of degree come in here. What I find interesting, something that occurred to me relatively late in the process of writing up this draft, which is still pretty imperfect, is that Kant seems to think that these two options are mutually exclusive and complete. So either you're thinking for yourself, or you're thinking under the direction of another. Bivalence here, right? Only these two options. I have my doubts about that. I don't think it's complete. But anyway, I think this is it's interesting to keep in mind that lack of interference or meddling by others is a negative aspect of epistemic autonomy, and self-direction is a positive aspect. This is quite parallel to the distinction between positive and negative aspects of freedom of the will, right? Absence of determination by foreign causes, as he says in groundwork, versus self-direction. So I think even if it were the case that these are all the options that you have, these two, it's still important to see the negative-positive contrast here. Now, I also thought quite a bit about the footnote in Was heißt sich im Denken orientieren. So it's on the handout here. And I think we've already heard it read, so I won't reread it again. You will have it in your working memory. Now, what is a Probierstein? Well, one way to understand what that means is to see it as a criterion, but I don't think what Kant has in mind here is a criterion of truth or anything like that. He talks about things like that in the first critique, but what's relevant here is rather that he wants to tell us that we should think for ourselves, deciding whether something is true or not true by using our own reasoning abilities. The following sentence is quite difficult, quite opaque, I think. Bei all dem, was man annehmen soll, sich selbst fragen, ob man es wohltulich finde, den Grund, warum man etwas annimmt. Oder auch die Regel, die aus dem, was man annimmt, folgt. A rule follows from what I'm assuming. So I'm again and again thrown out of the curve here when I read this. So one way one could read this would be to say that we are also determining the rules for the use of reason in an autonomous way. This raises certain questions about rule circularity, certain worries. What kind of reason do you invoke when you determine the rules for the use of your reason? Is there a vicious or benign form of rule circularity? I doubt that Kant really meant to go into this. So perhaps another way is closer to his intentions, namely that we have to give reasons for our belief. And just before the passage quoted here in the footnote, he talks about the importance of argument, and einer eigenen Untersuchung, one's own investigation. Okay, so I jump over some remarks concerning Sapere Aude, der Wahlspruch der Aufklärung. It's a slogan, it has a long history, it can be read in many different ways. Dare to be wise, how do I do that? Right? What do I need to do in order to be wise? Am I afraid of taking the step? There are all kinds of questions that are not not of supreme importance. I read it here as daring to use one's reasoning abilities, one's own, to think for oneself. Sometimes, and this is going to be important for the distinction between two kinds of epistemic autonomy that I see in Kant. Sometimes sapere aude is translated in English as dare to know. Now, if knowledge is taken as a domain of theoretical reason, something, the domain of Verstand, das Vermögen der Erkenntnis, a faculty of, Erkenntnis doesn't have a good English translation of cognition, as a nicht-sinnliches Erkenntnisvermögen. If that's what thinking for oneself is about, then it's overly narrow. Thinking for oneself has a much wider, has an unlimited domain, I think, in Kant. So it covers not just theoretical reason, but also practical reason and aesthetic reason. And it's no coincidence that in the Aufklärungsschrift, Kant mentions cases of moral conscience, the case of the arts, Künste und Wissenschaften. And each of these domains comes with its own standards of correctness. But they're all standards of reason in a very broad sense. So if Kant, if you are a realist in a certain sense of realism, namely about the domain of discourse, namely in the sense that you think that there is an ordinary truth predicate to be had in that domain of discourse and that verdicts in the domain of truth act, then we have to say, then we could say that's not an overly narrow conception of thinking for oneself, because whatever you think about, there's truth to be had. But Kant was not a realist in that sense. Even though there's a unity of reason, theoretical reasoning is different, significantly different from practical reasoning and from aesthetic reasoning. So one would have to characterize thinking for oneself in a broader sense of epistemic, using one's own reasoning abilities. And the more narrow sense is the sense of using one's own reasoning ability in truth act discourse, right, in a theoretical case. So we have a narrow notion of epistemic autonomy and a broader one. The broader one just says, use your own reason. Reason covers many different domains, only one of them is truth act. And when you're dealing with the truth act, the theoretical domain in particular, then you have a much more narrow sense of thinking for oneself about truth act questions. Okay, so that's also an handout, very briefly, broad and narrow epistemic autonomy. I think I'm not quite sure what exactly the importance of that distinction is, but it seems to me that it's good to keep that in mind. Now, before I go into conflicts between two different norms for epistemic autonomy, broad or narrow, I want to go a bit into the social aspect of epistemic autonomy according to Kant. And I think certainly he doesn't believe for 1 minute that one should be completely independent of others. There is neither Caspar Hauser there nor Robinson Crusoe. I can see two kinds of consideration in Kant in favor of an essentially social conception of autonomy. The first one, and we've talked a lot about this, I try to make this briefer than it would otherwise be. One has to think always the second maxim of common sense from the standpoint of another. There's one, I just looked up one passage where he says, von Standpunkt des anderen, right? So perhaps there are three formulations of everyone else, of someone else, and of the other, and it's not the other of othering philosophies here, thank goodness. It's one of the three maxims. I don't have to explain that. So, to use one's own reasoning abilities, the right way requires, this goes back also to our last paper before the lunch break, deliberation, but with and corrections by others. And if public deliberation between different subjects and free speech is repressed, then the Freiheit zu denken, the freedom to think, and the ability to think for oneself is also severely damaged. So, thinking for oneself, epistemic autonomy thus has an essentially social dimension from the beginning for Kant. We just can't think on our own without doing it in collaboration with others. Now you might say you're mixing up two different things. Thinking from a general standpoint is one thing, and deliberating with others is another thing. Couldn't you think from a general standpoint on your own without even looking at other people? And I don't think Kant has an explicit comment on that. Perhaps he has, and I've missed it. But I think he would say what I'm going to say, that Emmanuel and I, that you can only have a grasp of the standpoint of another if you have sufficient exchange with other people. Otherwise, perhaps he's anticipating George Herbert Mead and the importance of role-taking for all kinds of mental processes. Wouldn't be surprising because he was such a bright philosopher that we anticipated that. But I suspect that I don't have textual evidence. It's just charity that makes me suspect that Kant would say, you just cannot, you don't understand what the general standpoint is if you haven't been in the water of dealing with other people, with their objections, deliberating with them. So that's one thing. The second way in which epistemic autonomy is social has to do with theoretical reasoning, perhaps more than anything else. It has to do with testimony. I think it's uncontroversial that we all depend to an enormous degree on testimony. I think that's uncontroversial also in all the debates between reductionists and anti-reductionists. What is controversial is whether between Hume and Reid, and then later on, is whether what we know on the basis of testimony could be in principle known also on the basis of non-testimonial sources. And Hume says no. Hume says yes, Hume says yes, and Reid says no, and nowadays, after a long time, the majority, I think, of people who think about this are anti-reductionist. And where does Kant stand here? And as very often with Kant, he has an interesting middle position between the extremes. Are you an empiricist? Are you a rationalist? No, neither. There's a third option here. He holds that when it comes to empirical questions, historical, geographical, other questions, then knowledge is irreducibly based on testimony. Whereas when it comes to judgments of theoretical, speculative reason, or practical reason, or aesthetic reasoning, you're not dependent on testimony. That, by the way, does not mean that you don't have to think from a general standpoint. Going back to the first one, these are two different points. Kant, by the way, perhaps I can mention this, makes some really interesting remark, mainly in the Nachschriften zur Logik and in the lecture notes on logic, that I think I mainly found them there. So he remarks several times that belief based on testimony can be in as good a position as belief based on one's own experience, even in a better position. He also defends the view that as long as we, a kind of default entitlement, as long as we don't have positive reason to doubt the testimony, we're entitled, this is something, an externalist idea here, we're entitled to go with the testimony as long as we don't have positive reason to doubt it. He also thinks that we have a duty, or we should, both perhaps a moral duty, but also an epistemic duty. We should check on the credibility of the testifier. This is, again, nothing that's controversial in the debate. Hume and Reid, if you look at their criteria for good hearer practice, they have almost the same criteria. Are there independent testifiers that say the same thing? Is there something suspicious about the circumstances? Kant also gives us a list of criteria in the Logik Hexel or in the Warschauer Logik, which are not published in the Akademie-Ausgabe, been published by Tillmann Pinder some years ago. So he has lots of things to say which sound pretty contemporary when it comes to testimony. And he has this interesting view. Well, it depends on the topic. On some topics, we are irreducibly dependent on other people. On other topics, we aren't. But even on those other topics, moral reasoning, aesthetic reasoning, we still need to think with others. So that's an interesting combination of rejection of testimonial dependence, but acceptance of discursive dependence on others. So is there, going back to the conference abstract, is there a problem here? Is there a tension between epistemic autonomy and ideals of democracy, equality, and all that? And I don't think there is one. Not in principle. You can be epistemically autonomous, and that involves certain relations with others. Right? In some cases you have testimonial dependency. Is that bad in any way? Is that suspicious when you hold up ideals of democracy and equality? Only if other things don't work well, only if you have distorted and pathological ways of communicating with others. So for instance, technocracy and the unquestioned rule of experts is not a good thing, let's say, but it's different from reliance on expert by intellectually and politically mature citizens. These are different things. So the fact that we are socially autonomous, if we are epistemically autonomous in a social way, doesn't mean that we are socially related in a bad way. There are good and bad ways, and autonomy can fail because you don't have the right kinds of relations with these other people. I will go back very briefly to this at the end, if there's still time. Okay, so I said that there's a potential conflict between two epistemic norms in Kant, namely between a correctness norm and an autonomy norm. And I just listed the names of these two norms on the handout case you forget, so, or in case I forget. So the autonomy norm tells us that we ought to think for ourselves and of course do this correctly. Whenever Kant talks about using one's own reasoning abilities, he is assuming that one is using them correctly, the right way. Whatever you're using, you can use it the right way or the wrong way. So that's just an implicit assumption, implicit in the text, but I think it's pretty obvious that he meant that. The correctness norm demands that we do everything we can to reach the goal of our reasoning ends, whether it's truth. Perhaps the truth rule is not the right rule, perhaps there's a justified belief rule or a knowledge rule, whatever, we don't have to go into that. Whether it's truth, moral insight, aesthetic appreciation, etc., you should use, according to the correctness norm, your reasoning abilities the correct way, the right way. Now, you might think, what's the grip of this? What's the point of this distinction? In the case of moral reasoning and aesthetic reasoning, I think the autonomy norm and the correctness norm usually go hand in hand, but they can part ways in the case of theoretical reasoning. So let me explain that and start with going back to that footnote, part of that footnote on 146, und was heißt sich in Denken orientieren. There's a lot in that footnote. I don't know why he put so much in that footnote in such condensed form. He makes some interesting remarks there that I want to exploit. He makes remarks against those, welche die Aufklärung in Kenntnisse setzen. In other words, identify enlightenment with information. Now I go to the English. For it is rather a negative principle in the use of one's faculty of cognition, and often he who is richest in information is the least enlightened in the use he makes of it. I've received a lot of consolation from remarks like that myself. So knowing a lot does not entail being very much enlightened. And there are other passages which are even more drastic. Man muss die Freiheit haben, nach seinem Belieben töricht zu sein. One has to have the freedom to be foolish as one likes. And so let us even have some to be a fool in their own business if they just have the freedom to be a fool. So we can easily see here how there can be a conflict between being an autonomous reasoner but being wrong, or being right but not being autonomous. You can know something more, you can not know more because you've thought less about things for yourself and vice versa. And that's a nice example from the history of science. When Bohr and Einstein discussed the completeness or incompleteness of quantum mechanics, let's assume Bohr was right. Bohr was amazingly influential. As far as I know from historical accounts, many physicists thought, well, Bohr is saying it's complete. Von Neumann, which we haven't read, also apparently has proved that it's complete. So let's go with that. Whereas Einstein, let's assume quantum mechanics is complete, didn't believe it, thought a lot for himself, but missed out on some truth. So you have, on the one hand, people who got to the truth but didn't think that much about it themselves, and on the other hand, you have Einstein, who thought a lot for himself but missed out on the truth, assuming that quantum mechanics is complete. If you have doubts about that, then bring it up in the discussion. So I think these two things are not completely independent. Typically, when you think on your own, I think you also have the best possible chance of getting to the truth. Okay, you can tweak that a bit, and vice versa. But there can still be conflicts between these two norms. There can also be other conflicts. Let's not forget that getting to the truth is one thing, avoiding falsehood is another thing. And there's also a lot to be said about the relative priorities between these latter two groups, but let's put that aside. So, what should we do if there's a conflict, like between Einstein and Bohr? I'm a physicist. Bohr says this, but shouldn't I think about this myself? Kripke says proper names are rigid designators. Oh well, he was smart, he thought a lot about it, but shouldn't I think about it myself? What a conflict, how do we resolve this? Is there a resolution? Well, Kant didn't think that there are irresolvable normative conflicts. I mean, his main passages on the possibility of moral dilemmas, he rejected that. I think that can be generalized. He didn't think that there can be situations where two norms that are irreducible to each other conflict without a possible resolution. So what would then be a Kantian answer to the question, how should I resolve the conflict between the autonomy norm and the correctness norm? I can't find anything in Kant. That's a really interesting question. He probably had a view on this, but he was so busy pushing out all those classics of philosophy. I mean, that was the 18th century. People were more relaxed than nowadays about certain things, not about others. So what could one do? Perhaps one could go case by case. No, I'm leaving Kant aside now for a moment, only for a brief moment. Could go case by case, but still the question would be, yeah, but how do we do it in any particular case? Is there a resolution between these two norms when they conflict? Or one could inquire into the possibility that it's a question about how to distribute different styles of reasoning within the population of reasoners. We need to have the right proportion between Einsteins and Bohrs. Well, not followers of Bohr, not Bohr himself was pretty autonomous. Perhaps there are good proportions in groups of investigators that communicate with each other, where some just, the crazy ones think for themselves a lot, the others too, but not quite that much. So, but again, this doesn't solve our problem. It's an interesting problem. I don't know what the solution could be, and I don't think there is anything in Kant. Now, are these norms all epistemic norms? One could say, okay, we have a conflict between two epistemic norms. The correctness norm is certainly an epistemic norm when it's about narrow epistemic autonomy, when it's about truth at matters, then it's, one could say, a narrow epistemic norm. When it's about, say, moral reasoning or aesthetic reasoning, then it's a broad epistemic norm, but it's still an epistemic norm. Is the autonomy norm to dare to be wise, sapere aude, is that a purely epistemic norm? And I don't think it is. And now I thought I had a nice quote here. Yes, so Kant also describes thinking for oneself as a type of freedom. It's a case of freedom because it consists in using one's own reason and submitting to one's own reason's laws. Since these laws are self-given, this constitutes freedom as autonomy. Not thinking for oneself is a case of passively giving in to a heteronomy. So there is a certain a welcome commonality between practical autonomy of the will and epistemic autonomy, without collapsing one into the other. There is a lovely parallel structure. And there are other remarks. There is one reflexion, and it's on the handout, where he says, should I read it in German or in English? English perhaps? The German sounds much funnier. He was such a good writer. Aufgeklärt sein heißt Selbstdenken, den obersten Probierstein der Wahrheit in sich selbst suchen. Das ist in Grundsätzen meines Urteils den Grund des Vorwahrhaltens, denn ich muss es verantworten. Being enlightened means to think for oneself, to look for the highest criterion of truth in oneself. That is the principles of my judgment, the ground of my holding true, because I have to be responsible for it. So, you know, there's always the question, how much can you do with reflexionen in Kant? And this is a passing remark. But I think it's still interesting enough that we get an impression of an ethics of belief here. He's talking about responsibility. You know, there's the epistemic responsibility for going about one's own beliefs in a certain way. And also there's another hint in the opus postumum. You might think that's even worse to use in reflexion, but you use what you can get, where he talks about what humans could make of themselves, talks about self-perfection, and adds in brackets sapere aude. This suggests that the demands of enlightenment are also demands to perfect oneself. And perhaps one can add additional arguments for the claim that the autonomy norm is not merely epistemic, but also has something more to it. So what we have, if we have a conflict between a correctness norm and an autonomy norm, is not just a conflict between two epistemic norms, but we have a conflict between, let's say, three different kinds of reason: narrow epistemic reasons, broad epistemic reasons, and non-epistemic reasons. And if you then also flirt with the idea that not all reasons are comparable with each other, then it's turning into an even more interesting problem. Okay, so one more section is left. How much time is left for me? 5 minutes? Yeah, so this is just about restrictions of epistemic autonomy. Kant is quite clear about there being a distinction between justifiable and unjustifiable restrictions. He has this distinction between the public and the private use of one's reason. That's very confusing. I always have to remind myself, what does that mean again? So you use your reason in a public way, for instance, if you're an academic, and then you should be unrestricted. But when you're using it in a private function, you're using it as an occupant of a particular social role. For instance, as a citizen who has to obey the government, or as a judge who has to apply the laws, or as soldiers and military officers who have to obey orders. And here Kant says you are supposed to reason, not supposed to reason about it. You should obey, not reason, which is funny, because his buddy Frederick II famously said, reason as much as you want, as long as you obey. Kant seemed to think, no, that won't work. If you start to reason, you don't obey anymore. Perhaps, I always suspect him of potentially anticipating other people. Perhaps he anticipated Max Weber, who thought that state authority requires the automatic obedience, the non-thinking, blind obedience of the relevant people. Perhaps he thought that. What complicates this a bit further is that he qualifies this restriction by adding that the same person who should not reason but obey when they are occupying a particular role might then, when they're using their reason in a public way, reason about it. So this is a funny role conflict. So I obey blindly, but hey, after 5, after 6:30, I can reason critically. Can people compartmentalize that easily? I doubt it, but it's an interesting kind of social and political schizophrenia. Now, an alternative understanding, I don't know whether there are any hints of that in Kant, of obeying but not reasoning, would take the term reasoning in a much richer sense. Reasoning doesn't just involve thinking about things, but also acting on it. Perhaps it involves 2 things, not just thinking on your own about it, but in conversations with others, and then doing something about it. But I want to leave that open, whether that's close to anything in Kant. He has several examples for illicit restrictions of thinking for oneself, rulers who make their subjects unmündig, keep them in a state of minority, who suppress the public exchange of ideas, which is a necessary condition for thinking for oneself, I think, for Kant. He also mentions the priests who keep their, what are they, sheep, their followers in a state of minority. His main problem with that, he doesn't worry much about other restrictions, but his main worry about that is that with religion comes morality. And if people are in a state of minority with respect to religion, then they're also in a state of minority with respect to morality, and they shouldn't. There's a whole bunch of questions one can raise about that. Do we have a duty to be morally autonomous, and so on and so on. He also makes some unacceptable remarks about women, but I think he's just wrong about the abilities of women rather than presenting a defensible restriction. Okay, so I don't think, I'm trying to wrap this up now, I don't think there is, for Kant, much to worry about the initial worry that started this conference, that there could be at least a tension or a serious conflict between ideals of equality and democracy on the one hand and social aspects of epistemic autonomy, the second maxim about dependence on testimony. But as I mentioned before, there can of course be distortions and pathological forms of dealing with others, and I don't think, as far as epistemic relations with others are concerned, I don't think Kant said much about it, but these are things we nowadays might worry a lot about, and I think there really are research programs here for people to pick up, no matter how much they do with Kant. So, what can someone do who has an advantage, knows more about a particular topic than others? How can they use that and transform that into a form of social power, disadvantaging certain others? How does that work? How can one give away information in selective ways to mislead others? What about technocracy? When is dependence on expert a problem? When is it not a problem? What are the exact conditions? I don't know how much we can find in Kant. We're trying to figure that out. What is a good relation of a public with expert, and what is a distorted or pathological one? There are also questions about epistemic paternalism. I'm probably on the fence there. I would need more time to think about that. Is epistemic paternalism always a bad thing? Nudging Is that compatible with epistemic autonomy? What kind of nudging? I think we also nowadays, in our age of fake news, that some agents are apparently able to distort the moral and other kinds of reasoning of wide ranges of the public. I came here from the US, but I don't know how well things are here in Germany. And even said ignorance and stupidity as public virtues rather than vices. So I think there's a lot to do here to in a more or less Kantian spirit. And this goes I think this goes beyond Kant, or takes him beyond what we have in his works. But I think the social character of thinking for oneself, as such, that's not the problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks for an interesting talk, Peter. So there's a lot in there that I agreed with, and instead of going through that, I think I want to focus on something that I potentially disagree with, or want to push a bit. I don't know whether this is pushing it further or pushing back against what you said. So the thing that I found particularly kind of intriguing was this idea that we find in Kant a conflict between two epistemic norms. So, I mean, in the paper you express some ambivalence about what form this correctness norm takes, so what correctness consists in, but kind of for determinacy you assumed it was something like truth. So I'm going to kind of take you at your word, raise some problems for the correctness norm construed as a truth norm, which maybe will help us to think a bit more about, how this would look if the aim of our Erkenntnisvermögen is something other than true belief, and whether there's still a conflict if that's the case. So to get everything nice and clearly on the table, so you say there's a conflict between the correctness norm, which says roughly, do everything you can to reach the truth, at least restricting the discussion to theoretical reason, right? And the norm of autonomy, which says, think for yourself. And for maximum clarity, let's repeat that footnote from the end of the Orientierung essay. So, think for yourself means something quite determinate. It means whenever you're going to assume something, ask yourself whether the reason for which you're making that assumption could feasibly be made into a general principle for your reasoning. Okay, slightly loose translation, but slightly colloquial translation, but yeah. So the idea is your idea is that there's a conflict between do everything you can to reach the truth on the one hand, and ask yourself whether the reason could feasibly be made into a general principle for reasoning. So, yeah, in the draft paper you circulated that I saw a copy of, you suggested some textual evidence in favour of construing this as a truth norm. I wasn't particularly, I guess I wanted to press you more on that, but it sounds like you're just not very committed necessarily to that idea, so let me move quickly beyond that. So the next interesting point was these kind of textual evidence and this historical example of conflicts between a truth norm and a think autonomously norm. So let me start with the textual evidence of the unenlightened knower and the free fools. I guess I just want to raise some questions about whether we really have evidence of Kant thinking there's a conflict of norms here. So in a typical case of a conflict of norms, like in ethics, you have these tragic dilemmas or whatever. You've made someone a promise that you're going to pick them up from the airport, but there's someone's just been hit by a car on the street next to you, and you really have to help them. So there's nothing you can do. Like in order to do what one norm says, you have to break the other one. In order to, and it goes both ways. You can't possibly meet both norms. So let's think about this unenlightened knower who has lots of Kenntnisse, but is not making an enlightened use of them. So I don't think that has this structure of, I don't think that Kant's saying that this person has this structure of like, they couldn't meet both norms. There's a conflict such that they're not both mutually fulfillable. So Kant says that this person is rich in information, but is not enlightened in the use he makes of it. That seems to suggest that this person, maybe they've like read loads of factoids from some almanac or something, and they're like spouting them off. but they're not really doing much reasoning or, they're not really doing much with that knowledge. But that doesn't seem to entail that in order to think autonomously, they'd have to kind of give up all of these Kenntnisse, right? So it seems like if this is indeed a reliable source of information, it's such that these are genuine Kenntnisse, not just like illusory bits of information. Well then, yeah, thinking autonomously is going to lead this person to go like, yeah, that's a reliable piece of information, I'm going to carry on believing that, but now of course on the basis of some kind of maybe epistemic maxim that is generalizable, okay? So it doesn't seem to me there that this unenlightened knower is such that in order to meet the autonomy norm, they'd have to give up belief correctness or true belief. The reflection texts, it's hard to know what to make of these reflections, as you mentioned, but like looking at this one from the Anthropology manuscript, man muss die Freiheit haben, nach seinem Belieben töricht zu sein. So in that paragraph he starts off by saying, Vater des Volks, and then later in this paragraph he's talking about these Aufwandsgesetze, which apparently were these like laws governing which people from which classes could wear what clothes and things like that. So it seems like here he's talking about public policy and like what a ruler should do. So what he might mean here is like, politically speaking, the enlightened absolutist ruler should give people like the political freedom. There shouldn't be coercive power used to try and stop people from being foolish. So that seems to me that he's saying like, it's not necessarily he's saying that like using your powers of reason in an enlightened way are going to sometimes lead you into foolishness. It's more like having the political arrangement that's conducive of enlightenment is such that it gives people the freedom to be bloody idiots with their reasoning powers, as we've seen, in all the contemporary cases that we've seen, right? And then there are other places, Kant, so some of the quotations we heard earlier, Kant seems to think that if you use these maxims of common understanding, you're going to quickly shed all of your prejudices, right? So he does seem to think that these, following those norms of enlightened reasoning, that's going to have a salutary effect on, you're not going to be foolish, you're going to be less foolish, you're going to see through all of these superstitions that you previously believed, right? So yeah, I'm just not convinced that there's a genuine conflict between those norms. And then, yeah, so the Einstein case, it's an interesting one. So I guess the picture would have to be something like this, like Einstein misses out on acquiring a true belief because he doesn't believe Bohr. So I take it that's the picture that you're giving us. But so why should we think that Einstein's reluctance to defer to Bohr is a consequence of his adhering too closely to the autonomy norm? So like, as you've said, as you've argued, the autonomy norm doesn't say, don't believe what other people tell you. The autonomy norm is perfectly compatible with taking on board other people's testimony, other people's claims. And of course Einstein wasn't, like there's this caricature version where he just like, didn't want to believe that there was a difference. But that's not what actually happened. Like with some colleagues, they together wrote a paper on a paradox that's entailed by Bohr's interpretation. It's not as if he was just sticking his head in the sand. So yeah, I take it that it's not as if I guess the real life case is a bit complicated, but it's not as if Kant holds that to think autonomously, to think for yourself means don't believe Bohr, therefore miss out on his true belief, right? So I don't see a conflict there. So let me make a friendly suggestion about a case where a correctness norm, a norm trying to do everything you can to get true beliefs, might conflict with an autonomy norm understood as think in a way that on reflection seems generalizable as a process of thinking. So I think certain kinds of Gettier cases might have that structure. I was struck by Andrew's Lucky case from this morning. So you have middling evidence that your son has survived the fire. That plus your strong desire leads you to form the conviction that he did survive the fire, and luckily you're right. That seems like it's not doesn't pass. But forming beliefs in that way doesn't pass the autonomy norm. This isn't generalizable. If you were to regulate your assent by the maxim of like, if there's some evidence and you want it to be true, well then, I think that might even rob your beliefs of the objective representational purport in the end, or something like that. So that seems like a clear case of not adhering to the autonomy norm. And it's like, in this one-off case, there's a conflict between luckily getting a true belief and thinking autonomously. So I think that might be helpful. So as my last point, I want to kind of ask, how do things change if, in terms of that conflict, if we think of the kind of correctness norm not as pointing us towards true belief, but as something else? So for concreteness, here's a nice suggestion. What if the telos of our faculty of cognition is not true belief, but begreifen, so comprehension? So this is like, so Carl Schaefer has argued that that's the kind of highest epistemic goal according to Kant, and that's quite an attractive view, kind of systematically too. Well, if that's the case, then instead, in place of this kind of correctness norm, you're going to have a sort of comprehension norm. Do everything in your power to ground your cognitions in even more fundamental and general cognitions. So that might be the norm. And then the question would be like, well, can that comprehension norm conflict with the autonomy norm in the way that, I guess in the end I agree the true belief norm can conflict with the autonomy norm. And I'm tempted to think not, but I'll just, and Carl Schaefer argues that autonomy of reason and reason achieving begreifen, they end up coinciding. So let me just read a quote from Carl Schaefer's 2019 paper, Kant, Constitutivism as Capacity's First Philosophy. So he says, on Kant's conception of autonomy, for reason to be autonomous is just for its activities to be determined only by reason's own a priori principles. So the activity of reason will be autonomous just in case this activity is an absolute or unqualified instance of cognition from principles. So cognition from principles is just comprehension. So to say that reason's telos lies in autonomy is equivalent to saying that it lies in comprehension. But that, when I read that out now, that just sounded completely unintelligible. Should I try and make that more intelligible? I guess the picture would be that it's made so much sense, so I found Carl Schaefer's paper so convincing, but yeah. So I guess the picture would be like what kinds of patterns of reasoning are going to be the ones that pass this test of asking yourself, could I use this as a general principle for reasoning? Well, it's exactly the principles of reasoning that are discovered in the course of the critical project. Reason submits itself to its own kind of courtroom, and we realize in that process certain a priori principles, both in the theoretical sphere and in the practical sphere. So the kinds of principles that are like fully generalizable, that like we really can use as principles in general principles for our use of reason, they're going to be the a priori principles that Kant argues for in the course of his critical philosophy. So then the most autonomous ways of cognizing and forming beliefs and what have you is going to be kind of like subsuming your particular beliefs about what's going on now under increasingly general laws all the way up to those first principles derived from transcendental philosophy. So then it turns out the most autonomous use of reason is simultaneously going to be the use of reason that involves the most comprehension, the most comprehensive cognition. So if the norm is a comprehension norm rather than a true belief norm, it looks like autonomous use of reason and achievement of comprehension are going to coincide. There's not going to be a conflict of norms. If that makes sense.